in order to understand the future of the gold price, that one needs to take into account whether or not the current levels of government indebtedness in the United States represent credit risk. And to there, I need to bore your audience with a little bit of arithmetic. The Internal Revenue Service suggests that the aggregate private net worth of American citizens is about $170 trillion, a big number, big, big, big number. Against that, we have
Does that
13
include the natural resources as well, or is it just the household wealth? Does that include
household net worth. It doesn't include things like privatizing Yosemite National Park or anything like that. It's just their source of revenue.
Wealth.
Their source of revenue is you and I. You know, if you own a bond and they forget to pay you and you go to foreclose on Yosemite, you will learn that your creditor has nuclear arms and that's not available to you. So you have to throw that out. It's a specious argument. Their source of revenue is their chattel, you and I. So their source is 170T. The on-balance sheet liabilities of the U.S. government, what they owe the bondholders, is $39 trillion. And by the way, increasing at $2 trillion a year before the war. A much more troubling statistic, one which doesn't get quoted much in the mainstream media, is that the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the net present value, not the nominal value, but the net present value of unfunded entitlement promises now exceeds $120 trillion. That is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, military pensions, federal government pensions, $120 trillion. And that number, according to the Congressional Budget Office, is growing between $2 and $4 trillion per year.
That's the invisible debt, right? The debt that we have, the obligations we have, but they are not really realized yet. We're going to realize them over the next few years.
Not so invisible, my friend. People who are watching this podcast could look at me, a 73-year-old. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. My generations, apologies to you, have voted ourselves all kinds of cool benefits, but we forgot to pay for them, and the bill is coming due. So if you combine those two debts, the 39 trillion and the 120 trillion, you get to a stunning number, 159 trillion. Now, just for fun, let's subtract the Fed's own balance sheet from that, right? Let's not double count. That takes the number down to 153 trillion. So we own 170 trillion and we own 153 trillion. There's a $17 trillion delta, which we are using up at between $4 and $7 trillion a year. If you believe that righteousness will return to the American political scene, that we'll control spending and live within our means, you aren't concerned about that. If rather than being a believer, you're a student of history, you have a real reason to be concerned. It seems to me that where we own 170 and we owe 153, and what we owe is increasing by $5 trillion a year, that we ask ourselves whether we will have an honest default. In other words, whether we say to the bondholders, too bad, so sad, no payment. Whether we say to old folks like me, yeah, you paid into Social Security for 60 years, but there's no money. You ain't getting it out. That's an honest default. Difficult to do politically. I think the answer is a dishonest default. In the decade of the 1970s, the last time that we confronted this sort of dilemma, the purchasing power of the US dollar, according to the Office of Management and Budget, declined by 75%, which is to say a basket of goods and services that cost a consumer $1,000 in 1970 cost that consumer $4,000 in 1980. Not coincidentally, in that decade, where the purchasing power of the US dollar, according to the US government, not some cranky old libertarian, declined by 75%, the gold price went up 26-fold. From $35 an ounce to $850 an ounce. Now, by the way, I'm not suggesting that from here the gold price goes up 26-fold. What I am suggesting to you is it is more likely than not, looking at history, that gold maintains its purchasing power, real purchasing power, while the US dollar loses 75% of its purchasing power. If you believe that, and you don't believe that there will be a political accord which balances our budget, then I think thinking about a 10-year doubling or quadrupling or tripling or quadrupling of the nominal price of gold, the US dollar price of gold, seems like a very prudent precaution as a saver.
If you're enjoying this discussion with Rick Rule, we have an exclusive segment that we've filmed with him on Epoch TV. We'll leave you a link below. You can just go there and watch it and let us know what you think. Now let's go back to the rest of this episode. Rick, you have been studying a lot of these different metals and commodities, and copper is one of them that is in more of an industrial commodity. Can you tell us what are you seeing right now with copper?
Several things you need to know about copper. The first is that the demand that you and I are familiar with, the copper for AI data centers, copper for electric cars, things like that, is growing extremely rapidly. Extremely rapidly. The material lifestyle that you and I enjoy in the United States is an energy intensive lifestyle, and we want to live better, which requires more copper. What listeners to the Epoch Times probably recognize is that there are 1 billion people on Earth who have no access to primary electricity. None. We have done a wonderful job as humans in the last 30 years reducing abject poverty around the world. We have caused 2 billion people worldwide from going from desperate poverty, being merely poor. We've done a great job. And I think we're going to solve that problem in the next 25 years, which is to say, I think we will solve for the electrification of the world, which is a wonderful achievement. And it's going to require a ton of, many tons of copper. It is estimated that we will need as much copper in the next 35 years as we have mined in all of recorded history. That's truly a challenge. Meanwhile, we have for 30 years underinvested in copper exploration, in copper development, and in copper construction. I was at Metals Week in London at the end of last year, and I heard a really, truly surprising paper there that suggested that the 10 largest private copper producers in the world require spending $250 billion constant 2025 dollars, which is to say non-inflated dollars, to maintain copper production at current levels.
250 billion to maintain what we're producing.
To maintain what they're producing. And by the way, we are producing at a deficit, which is to say we aren't producing as much as we're consuming. So without increasing the deficit, we need to spend $250 billion. But demand is increasing by 2% compounded. There is no way, no arithmetic way, that the world doesn't experience copper shortages in the next 10 years, absent a global depression. You can have supply shortfalls if you have a demand shortfall and not rationed by price. But to the extent that we avoid a global depression, which I certainly hope we do, the only way that we're going to balance supply and demand out 5 years and 10 years will be to ration by price. That's the only way. The biggest copper producers in the world have identified a $250 billion need, constant dollar need, and they've identified about $150 billion worth of capital, which is to say they're $100 billion short. The problem with that is that they estimate that the input costs of building and mining copper are increasing between 8 and 10% a year. So that $250 billion number, that $250 billion need, increases by 8 or 10% a year compounded for 10 years. It's a real challenge in front of us. Paradoxically, for those old guys like me who've been in the mining business for 50 years, it's a real opportunity too. But for most of the rest of the world, it's a pure challenge.
You see a big opportunity in copper mining, in a sense.
Enormous. I see a range of opportunities. The first thing is that copper mines, great big copper mines, ones that will have strategic importance to the Americans, to the Chinese, to the Japanese. Mines that'll produce for 25 or 30 years or 35 years are much more valuable than people think they are. Much more valuable because they don't need to get permitted by government. They don't need to be financed to be built because they're already built. And because when, as I believe is inevitable, the copper price goes up, there won't be any construction lead time before they can take advantage of it. If you are making pretty good money at $4.50 copper, you're going to be making a lot of money at $10 copper. A lot of money. And there's going to be no lag time between the time the copper price rises and the time that you have copper available for production. That's really important to note. The really high quality, long lived mines, the Kamoas of the world, the Tenke Fungurumis of the world, the Grasbergs of the world, Las Bambas, those mines are worth a lot more than people think they are. It is inevitable, however, that because there has been a hiatus of new discoveries, high quality new discoveries, which will be at the lower end of the cost curve, will enjoy a lower cost of capital and better access to capital. There will begin to be competition to finance these mines into production in return for secured output. The Japanese, through the Sumitomos and the Mitsuis of the world, are already willing to offer concessionary capital, as are the Chinese, as will the Americans. It's important to note big opportunities ahead of us in copper. In the very near term, in the very, very near term, I suspect, ironically, copper to be weak because I think we're headed into an economic slowdown as a possible consequence of this war.